Hi. Thanks very much for your kind remarks, and sorry to put you through a slight torture of checking me up online, which many of my friends complain about endlessly, saying there's too much on. But never mind. But just on one thing, of course, when I started writing, computers had not yet got going. And the last book I wrote in pre-computer days was in 1984. I remember typing it out very patiently on India after the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi. But anyway, Mujtaba, thank you very much for inviting me. You've gathered a great team, and I'll move on to the subject without any further delay. I think in order to understand what has been happening in the Arab world basically since the early 90s, one has to understand a huge event that took place in world history, which is now taken for granted, or even, given the state of amnesia that we live in, many people don't even know what it was or why it happened or anything like that. And that was the implosion of a country that was once called the Soviet Union, and the collapse of all its satellite states in Eastern Europe, and the re-entry of capital and capitalism into that country in a horrendous way, in a way that was very punishing to the people of that country, not to the elite, because in many cases members of the former elite moved in and became oligarchs. Virtually every Russian oligarch, not every, but I would say between 80 and 90% of the oligarchs were members of the party apparatus in one way or the other. Now, we won't go into that and what happened there, but the result of this, and by the way, this event took the United States by surprise. They were not prepared for it, despite the huge amount of money expended on intelligence services, on buying Soviet spies, on all this. They did the opposite. They exaggerated Soviet strength militarily and, failed to see what was going on internally, because they couldn't believe that leaders from within that country would dismantle their state while not meaning to do so. But that is effectively what happened. From our point of view, from our interests, the collapse of this huge chunk of the world opened it up again. Globalization, which was the story, the narrative of the period, but also to a fact which I write about and talk about a great deal, and have done over the last 10, 15 years, is the emergence of the United States as the world's only imperial power. Something which has never happened in the history of humanity before. From the period of the ancient world right till today, this is the first time that a single country has dominated the world, which has military strength that equals that of the next 8 countries put together, that despite a lot of talk saying that it's collapsing or it's near the end, which talk I don't believe, remains, despite the economic crises, a dominant player in the world, an empire from within which arose the single most important development that more or less determines everything, how we think, how we write, how we communicate: the internet. That didn't come from Japan, didn't come from China, didn't come from Europe, came from the United States. And I stress this to counter foolish and over-optimistic and arguments which say that the US is finished. It's not finished. And we have to deal with it and understand it for what it is. And long before 9/11, in the 90s, people within Bush the father's administration were talking about what are we going to do in a world where everyone has the same economic system as we do. Because prior to that, of course, the fight was against communism, which represented or claimed to an alternative social and economic system. And against this system, the United States effectively said, we are superior because we have something you don't have, which is freedom, i.e. democracy, democratic rights. And on that they were correct, it has to be said. This was one big failing in that system, which they didn't try and correct. And when a country amongst their number did, they invaded it. So, with this in mind, began a process of seeing how the world could be remade, could be changed, and they were thinking about invading Iraq long, long before 9/11. So that when 9/11 happened, the first thing Condoleezza Rice said, we should now use this to change the world as we see fit, quoted by someone at the meeting who subsequently wrote a whole book about it. So this reformation, recolonization, I put it, of the Arab world is taking place because it can take place. And because the world's great imperial power, and only imperial power, wants it to take place. They've messed it up badly, of that there is no doubt at all, including in the ranks of the Pentagon, who were nervous about the Iraq war because they hadn't been given any idea what they were going to do after they took the country. So we have a situation now where the process that is going on is a model of recolonization favored by the United States, unlike other imperial powers. Historically speaking, the European empires took large tracts of land, ran the countries, set up countries on their own model, whether it was the British in India or the French in Algeria, to a lesser extent in Africa. That was the model. The American model of empire was always a bit different. And directly occupying countries and keeping them with their own troops there permanently is not a model they liked particularly in the old days. So the way they governed their part of the world, mainly South America, was through local relays, military dictators in the main, but where they could discard them, they used local politicians, oligarchs, crooks of one sort or the other. That's how they ruled. And that is how that empire functioned. And I think that this, after the disasters of the occupation of Iraq and the big failure of it on a political level, not necessarily a strategic level, they are now casting around to see how they can move back to an old way of governing the world and not getting very far. And the Arab Spring, so-called, took them by surprise as well, because despite all the intelligence networks, they didn't predict it. And that, of course, as a footnote, is a very positive sign. It means that you can have all the surveillance you want. You can have, 1 in every 100 citizens working for you. Not that that is the case, by the way, but you could. And when things happen, you can rarely predict them because you're looking for very obvious styles of revolt. And when the revolt takes on a different form, it's virtually unpredictable. As were the occupation of the squares after the Tunisian events, the speed with which the Tunisian dictator fled the country, two very important aspects of that crisis. Victory was immediate. The French were persuading him not to leave. The French defense minister sent a special message saying, hang on in there for a few more weeks. Our troops are on the way to protect you. But he didn't wait. He knew more about himself and his wealth than the French did, in all likelihood. So he got out with the money, and whether the money is in Swiss banks or in Saudi banks, we don't know, but probably a bit in both. And this triggered off what became known as the Arab Spring. What were the problems with the Arab Spring? This mass movement was, of course, amazing. The spontaneity was fantastic. The speed with which the movement spread from one country to the other, incredible. But what about the politics? What were the demands? I wrote the week after, perhaps what we are witnessing is an Arab 1848, but 1848 in Europe. But it wasn't quite like that. Of the demands, three demands which the Europeans took up in 1848, freedom, justice, equality, solidarity, some of these were absent. Liberty wasn't, but some of the other demands were absent. And solidarity with the rest of the Arab world was not consciously sought on virtually any level, which marked a big move back from the movements of the 50s and the 60s, which had still preserved the idea of an Arab nation. Because under Ottoman rule, though the people didn't feel divided into nation states. They were part of the Ottoman Empire. So the big travel routes were from city to city, from Baghdad to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to Cairo, from Baghdad to Amman, from Amman to Damascus. People moved freely, part of the Ottoman Empire, but not within these circumscribed states. That was a gift of the British and French after they won the First World War. And it's always interesting to think what might have happened had the Ottomans sided with the Western Allies and not with Germany in the First World War, what the differences would have been both in what became Yugoslavia and, of course, the Middle East. But it's pointless, speculation is pointless. These countries were given borders. Syria, the region called Syria, was sliced, and with a coastal strip called Lebanon created by the French, just because they thought in cases of emergency we will have a strip of land that we control. A constitution was imposed on the country of equality, 50% for Christians, 50% for Muslims. Not a great idea in my opinion, but anyway it was done. And so all these states that we see in the Arab world were created effectively after the First World War and strengthened after the Second World War. In Saudi Arabia, one of the big problem states in that region, has been such since the 20s, since after the Second World War, when the British Empire signed a compact with this family which has been running it ever since. And as the British Empire was collapsing, the Americans took over, and Roosevelt, under the Roosevelt administration, did the deal. And the one famous meeting was held in a pink Cadillac, I'm told, but it doesn't matter where it was held and the deal was done. We're going to protect you, we're taking over from the British. And that is what has been the case ever since. And without some of this history, it is not easy to understand what is going on. So what was the governmental mode after the Second World War. Saudi Arabia, backed by the United States, a monarchy based on a large religious sect in Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabis, but tiny within Sunni Islam globally. This was Saudi Arabia. Little tribal leaders were given tiny kingdoms, which became the imperial petrol stations that we now know as the Gulf states. This is what happened in that peninsula. Outside, Iraq had a monarchy, Jordan had a monarchy, cousins, of course, from a different family to the Wahhabis. The French, who were given domination in Syria, refused to tolerate a monarchy for Syria because they said, we come from a republican tradition. We as colonialists, we are imperialists, but our traditions are different. So we're not going to impose a monarchy. Something that didn't bother them in the case of Morocco, by the way. So I'm not inclined to treat this as totally sacrosanct, this particular view about French republicanism. And none of these countries had even an ounce of democracy in it. And yet they were governed, controlled, if not directly ruled, by imperial powers who proclaimed democracy to be one of their motivations, who constantly talked about it but did not allow it to be practiced in the colonies. And so some of the early hostility to democracy arose from the fact that the states had been created and dominated by British and French imperialism in the interwar years. And the first wave of a break with the old European empires came in the 50s and 60s, when you had military revolutions in Egypt, in Syria, in Iraq, and for the first time there was talk once again of a united Arab nation with 3 concurrent capitals. That didn't work out, and here the problem did not lie in the imperial powers, the problem lay within. The weaknesses and failures of the Arab leaders of these revolutions made it impossible to create something more meaningful. The other aspect which we have to understand is that because of the hostility to the West, the type of governments they preferred, because they genuinely thought they were more progressive, were the Soviet and Eastern European style. Single-party states, single-party domination, monopoly of all information, etc., etc., which, in my opinion, and I've been saying this for a long, long time, was not a great idea either for the Russians and Eastern Europeans or the people who did it in parts of the Middle East, Africa, Asia, etc. This did pose huge problems. So there has been no tradition of democratic rule in most of these countries. And that is something that has to be taken into account. Democracy was not the priority of the European imperial powers, and democracy is not the priority of the American imperial power today. And democracy, by the way, just so we don't mystify the term, is something that the West and North America only got, in the fullest sense of the word, after the First World War, when women were given the right to vote. Prior to that, you had a truncated democracy based on gender and partially also based on property before that. So this notion that capitalism and democracy are coeval is not true, it's nonsense. And capitalism existed for 600 years. Prior to the first signs of democracy. And it's also worth recalling that the democracy that was obtained through struggle. The Revolutionary War in the United States to drive the British out meant that they had to write themselves a constitution, which of course denied the slaves the right to vote. but it was a democratic constitution within limits, and of course it denied women the right to vote. But it was an attempt. And in Britain itself, democracy came through huge struggles over a period of 200 years. And I stress this so that, you know, so that we see this in a global thing. I don't believe in Arab exceptionalism. I never have. But I do think it's impossible to understand the Arab world without understanding the two sets of imperialisms that have dominated it for a long time. Without that, any understanding is impossible. Now, the third thing that entered the Arab world, and of course, partially, but only partially, explains the exceptionalism, is that the creation of Israel in 1948 by the British Empire, effectively, later backed by the United States, but considerably later, was seen by the Arab population as a whole as a huge wound in the Arab body politic. There's no getting away from it, whether you support Israel or don't. It just is a fact, and the more intelligent Israeli leaders knew what they were doing. If you read the early Zionists, Ben-Gurion, Moshe Dayan, they say, well, of course they will fight us. How could they not fight us when we are kicking them off the land, when we're stealing their property? How can they not fight us? And some argued that, okay, then let's kick all of them out from the Holy Lands, and this was rejected. But the discussion certainly took place. The Israeli leaders, very cold and hard-hearted as they were, knew what was going to come. They were not surprised. And they thought that they would be better at it now. And they were not totally wrong in that, in terms of fighting wars. And I think it's an open question still, despite all the ideology that emanates from that country, whether Israel would have been created had there not been a Judeocide in Europe, and had not the Axis powers, in major Germany in the lead, wiped out millions and millions of Jewish people, with very little intervention, by the way, on that theme by either the United States or Britain. I mean, you know, if one wants to think about that, they knew where the railway tracks were going. Intelligence reports told them the Jews are being burnt. Why the hell didn't they go and bomb those railway lines? And now they boast in some cases that we fought. Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, marginally more intelligent than Harper. He actually said in one talk, we fought the Second World War to save the Jews. I mean, completely blind to history. And not even realizing that if you say that's the reason we fought the war, you then have to say it was a huge defeat, because we might have defeated them militarily, but in our main aim we lost. They won. But they don't say that. So the creation of Israel created something which till now remains an unsolved issue, an unsolved problem. And it's something in which the West is complicit. I mean, it was not the Palestinian Arabs who were responsible for the genocide of the Jewish people in Europe, but they have become its indirect victims. That is the reality. And they are ignored, treated as marginal people, both by the Israelis and their backers. And it's not till a grassroots movement has sprung up, by young people mainly, on university campuses, including in the United States, that people are now beginning to take notice, including the Israeli government. BDS has scared them much, much more than the bomb throwers of Hamas or whatever other group. It's the BDS because it's a much larger in scale and actually has an effect, both moral and economic. And so we're living in interesting times. But the main default, and I don't even blame them because there was no tradition. By the time the Arab Spring happened, any remnant of progressive Arab politics had been virtually wiped out. I mean, memories of the Arab left, which used to be very strong. One of the largest communist parties in the Middle East was the Iraqi Communist Party, which had on its central committee Christians, Muslims, Sunni, Shia, women, was wiped out actually by Saddam on the say-so of the CIA. So they were friends once, as everyone knows. And they were friends when they used Saddam to fight the Iranians, because that became the big threat in the late 70s and early 80s. Intolerable, appalling war in which millions of Iraqis and Iranian people died. Totally unnecessary war. To defeat a country which you were responsible, being in the state it was, by backing its corrupt, torturing rulers, which they did in Iran for decades. So everything that happens has a past, it has a history. It's not something that is happening just now and can be forgotten in 10 days' time when something more horrific comes up. Important to understand that, I think. And it was this blankness, this huge space that was left in Iran in the late 70s, in the Arab world, 60s, 70s. The 67 war was decisive in defeating Arab nationalism. It was this that created a vacuum in which Islamist groups rose. Not the groups which we will talk about in a minute, but traditional Islamist groups, the Jamaat-e-Islami, the Akhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and other parts of the country. Many of these, by the way, had worked with the United States in the Cold War era. They now rose and offered an alternative. And the alternative they offered has very little in it, if anything, that could be even loosely termed progressive. It's just that they were opposed to the incumbent regimes, which were authoritarian and corrupt. And given the lack of any other choice, they were successful. And they were also successful in utilizing the new neoliberal economics that were being applied in all these countries to create. I remember interviewing a Muslim Brotherhood leader in Cairo several years ago, over 10 years ago. And I asked him very, calmly, I said, well, how do you explain your popularity? I mean, I've seen it with my own eyes. And he said, you don't like us. I said, I have to be honest, I don't, but it's my background, forget it. Don't take it personally. I just want to know where you stand on some of these issues. And he said, no, I want to tell you because people like you need to know. And actually what he said was quite on. He said, if you think that we go around forcing people to recite the Quran every time we go and talk to them, we wouldn't get very far. We don't do that. He said, do you know which is the largest group that works with us in Egypt? I said, what? The doctors. We control the doctors' union. They work for us. We set up free clinics in many poor areas, not just in Cairo, different parts of the country, give people free medicine, free doctors, free consultation, and of course they know who we are. And the Jamaat-e-Islami leader told me exactly the same thing in Pakistan. So it's not just ideology, it's not just religion, it is largely that, but it's more than that. It's taking over something which the state no longer provides, And it's becoming an opposition which no longer exists. The old left progressive oppositions to these regimes were completely wiped out. So the Arab Spring was brought to an end very soon, as Mujtaba said earlier, because there was no political alternative. It's no good just saying in Egypt that, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood won. Well, they won. Yes, they won. They were seen as the representatives of the movement because there was no other political party which could take them on, or even wanted to take them on, or even thought that they needed a party. So they won. And it's the same story then, as we saw in Algeria years before that. If you launch an election, the Algerian government, with heavy pressure from the French, stopped the election midway, which created a civil war in which bloody crimes were committed by both sides, it has to be said. And that war destroyed the social fabric of Algeria, from which it is at long last beginning to recover. In Egypt, they let the election happen, and then what had to happen, happened. Morsi became the new president. And luckily for the military, I say fortunately for the military, he was not very bright. This is a problem with many politicians all over the world, as you know well. That it's the caliber of politics has declined all over the world. And it's the same in the Arab world. I mean, there were leaders of the Brotherhood who I didn't agree with, but who were extremely intelligent people. Many of them had left. So this guy started trying to do deals with the secret police, which they had tortured many of their people for years, saying to them, now we are president, do for us what you did for Mubarak. That sort of thing began to happen. Thinking they could just take over the apparatus, the existing apparatus of the Egyptian state, and that would be fine. Well, how could it be fine? The whole movement had been for democratization, for ending the corrupt judiciary, for dismantling various institutions of the state. So these guys became extremely unpopular rapidly. And the military then used this, and they used the liberals, and they used many young people to organize a fake, semi-fake election, and Sisi won. At the same time, there was huge repression. And Morsi, the elected president, is now sentenced to death and, you know, sitting in death row in an Egyptian prison. And we've ended up with a military dictator who is worse than Mubarak. So that has been, and I think the reason for this, seriously, is the lack of a political understanding and a political approach. And this spread. The squares, occupied squares as an image and as an idea, interestingly, spread to the United States. I mean, where did they get the idea of occupy? It came from the Arab world. So the squares moved from Cairo to New York and the Bay Area and LA and other parts of the States. Problems were exactly the same. Okay, we've occupied the squares, we want good things, how to obtain them? In the United States, the question didn't go that far, but it has come up again in this incredibly enthusiastic campaign by many of that same generation for Bernie Sanders. That is partially a reflection of that. In Britain, the movement of the squares was not so huge, but it has erupted again in electing a leader of the Labour Party who could be arrested under the terrorism laws in place. I mean, he's been a solid supporter of the Palestinians for the last, I don't know how many, 40 years. I've known him that long, and all that time He's been a very fervent supporter of the Palestinian cause and is against nuclear weapons, wants to ditch Britain's right. So, you know, things happen, things change, and the speed with which this happened again took everyone by surprise. And many other things could happen which will take us by surprise. But we also suffered defeats. And what happened to the Arab Spring was a defeat. And what happened after the occupation of Iraq was not a victory for the United States in the normal sense of the word, though some argue it was a victory, but it certainly was a defeat for anyone remotely progressive who saw what had happened to the country. And then the question arises, which is a very serious question now. Was Iraq better off under Saddam Hussein? This is a serious question. Many, many Iraqis who were imprisoned by him, some women who I know who campaigned against the war, who suffered badly in prisons, you talk to them now, they said there's no comparison. No comparison. It was better, life was better under Saddam Hussein. And you ask them why, and they speak. They think, look, he was so-and-so, we know that. But in terms of gender, education, health, we were amongst the more advanced countries in the world. We employed more women in universities than every other Arab country, but many European countries and North American countries. And this one woman professor gave me a figure which I later checked out. She said if you go to Iraq in the 1980s, we had more women teaching at various grades, at various levels in the University of Baghdad than they have teaching in Princeton today. So they said, we miss all that because, you know, the minute this darkness came and the Americans dismantled the entire structure, social structure, political structure of Iraq, something they had not done in Japan, something they had not done in Germany, something they had not done in Italy. 80% of Mussolini's structure within the state, army, magistrates, judiciary, lawyers, was left in place. Likewise in Japan. In Germany, more people were arrested and charged, but 60% of those who had worked for the Nazis were left in place because the new enemy was communism, and anyone who could help against that enemy was useless. Which is why many of those who fought with fascists, on the side of fascists, were given refuge all over the Western world. I think you had a healthy Ukrainian quota, if my memory serves me right, in this country. Many, many right-wing people fled. The Ustash from Croatia, helped by the Vatican. God knows where they all ended up. Some ended up in Australia, some in Canada. Very eagerly were they welcomed. And they were certainly not of old Canadian stock. So, given what has happened now, what does it look like? Basically, it seems to me that the Middle East is being divided up into tiny Bantustans. Iraq, the unity of Iraq is gone, long gone. So you have a Kurdish part of Iraq, which the Turks are not happy with. You have southern Iraq, which the Iranians are very dominant in, and then you have Sunni Iraq, where the Saudis are intervening. I mean, I'm glad Obama at least had the decency to say that had we not gone into Iraq, ISIS would not have existed. It's good he said that, actually, because it's the first attempt to sort of accept some responsibility for this mess that is going on in that country. Similar things with different responsibilities going on in Syria. It's being broken. So we're going to have the only two countries in the Middle East that will remain unbroken are probably, because the Americans don't want them to be, Saudi Arabia and Egypt. And the rest of the Middle East is in a dire situation. I have not known it in such a bad situation before. I mean, if you look at what they did to Libya, true, the initial uprising against Gaddafi was popular, but the minute people saw British, French, and Qatari troops coming in, and NATO saying we're going to start the bombing, a lot of the tribes who had initially thought let's get rid of Gaddafi changed their minds and decided to fight back. A 7-month NATO campaign ensued. We don't know the figures of how many Libyans died. 20,000, 30,000. Some of the SOAS academics who go in and out of the Foreign Office, I asked them, how many people have you killed in Libya? Any ideas? And they said, no, well, Tariq, you're always vicious. I said, no, it's not vicious. I want to know how many people you've killed in this so-called war to liberate and bring democracy to Libya. So he said, well, you have a guess. I said, 30,000. He said, closer to 20. I said, thank you. And what happened in Libya after they dumped Gaddafi? Well, you can see it. Effectively, 3 hardcore jihadi groups occupy that country. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and a local group, which was given pride of place in the NATO invasion. And they were told you can do what you like to destroy the old regime, you will never be charged with war crimes or punished. That's what the Libyan Islamists were told, and they did everything they could. Killed, raped, butchered, killed many people who were identified in a minor capacities with the previous regime. And this is then called democracy. This is what is happening in Libya. The same fight is now going on in Iran. And then this events triggered off something which existed in a loose way, but which has now become very dominant thanks to the Saudis and the Iranians. Because, of course, many Iraqis remind you, Shia and Sunni Iraqis, that if the Iranians had opposed the war in Iraq very strongly, it probably would not have taken place. I don't know if probably not would it not have taken place, but it certainly would have made the United States think. They had the support of Iran in both Afghanistan and Iraq, because the Iranian regime goes on the old motto, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And since Saddam was an enemy and the Taliban were enemies, they backed the United States. So much for radicalism. And this breakup of this region, with countries very narrowly defending their own interests, is partially responsible for the mess, apart from the wars. And these wars have now gone on. If you start with Afghanistan, all these wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan have gone on longer than the First and Second World Wars put together. Think about it. Just think of the effect that has on the fabric of a society, on the lives of ordinary people. And then there's shock and horror when these people can't bear it anymore, try and seek refuge elsewhere. I mean, the bulk of people taken in, who've taken in the refugees, have been neighboring states. Europe is being asked to take 250,000 out of 2 million refugees. And there are complaints, not all the time. And my answer to these people is very clear. Don't go and fight wars and you won't get refugees on this scale. You're responsible for it. I mean, you know, it's comparable. Some people who recall the refugees after the Second World War say that this is the biggest wave of human movement they've seen since the Second World War. when the defeated Germany, saw the expulsion of Germans, ethnic Germans from Czechoslovakia, parts of Russia, Poland, etc. It was one large mass sweeping across Europe. And this is the second time it's happened on this level. So how is it all going to end? I don't think anyone has the answers, because once you open the box, it can go in any direction. And the one thing that we're told not to discuss, increasingly, is Israel-Palestine. But why? Why has this become a forbidden subject? Why is the millionaire, billionaire arms dealer in LA, who's the husband of Senator Dianne Feinstein, threatening UCLA that unless you stop bashing the Israelis, we'll cut off funding and my senator wife will know how to deal with you guys? This just happened this last week. Why? Are they so frightened of ideas? It's not a question of terrorism, because most of these debates take place and many anti-Zionist Jews participate in them. One of my old friends told me, he's a professor at UCLA, Israeli, served in the Israeli Air Force, finally couldn't take it anymore and came and got a job in the United States. And he said, I went to speak at a meeting and young Zionists heckled me, wouldn't let me speak. And they couldn't call me anti-Semitic, but they said they have the other word, and they just started chanting at me, self-hating Jew, self-hating Jew. So I said, well, what did you do? He said, I just said, hey, just listen to me. I promise you I don't hate myself, but I do hate you. What to do? I mean, the coverage of this dispute in Canada, a country to which I come often, has just become unbelievable. I mean, on this criteria, at least 3 columnists on the Israeli daily Haaretz would be locked up or not allowed to speak. And I often say to North American journalists, okay, we know the problems, but can't you just plead with your editors, just publish 1 article a week from Haaretz? Just 1. We're not asking for too much. By Amira Haas or Gideon Levy or people who write and tell the truth. They do exist in Israel. And nothing's happened to them so far. So why can't this be done in the West? What Israelis can read, it seems Western citizens can't read because they'd get very upset. And they might actually begin to do something about it. And it's appalling, really, what is going on in university life. They've started this in Britain as well, in some minor universities, to test the waters. And it's failed so far. And there have been protests at attempts to do so. And in the United States, many American campuses support BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, which is totally non-violent. Totally non-violent. And that is being charged with anti-Semitism. So, if discussion is sealed off, and this happens, then quite honestly, not just on this, but on other levels too, what is happening to democracy in the West, which my last book, The Extreme Center, is about, indicates that we are in some ways close to the twilight years of democracy, or traditional forms of democracy, and how it functions. And only that is permitted which is decreed from above. You can talk on this, you can't talk on that. I mean, you look at the mainstream media. I mean, CBC has really gone down. But the private media, completely appalling, most of them. And so it's not a very good example. Democracy in the Arab world, when it comes, will have to be better. Now, what of the jihadi current in Arab politics? What do they do? First, I think, despite the latest wave, we have to understand that ISIS didn't come from a clear blue sky. It wasn't a thunderbolt. This was part of the Saudi and, after the Saudis, Turkish policy to try and create a Sunni alliance against Iran, against the Shias, which is a huge tragedy for that world. But it succeeded. And one reason it succeeded is the United States, when it took Iraq, gave power effectively to Shia clerical parties in that country. And as I said, destroyed the apparatus of the other side. And many of these militias, not all, some of the Shia militias in Baghdad carried out large-scale ethnic cleansings, which cemented the divide. In a country where even in the Ba'ath Party, when it was founded, you had 50 to 60% Shias on its central committee. So this is not something deep inside people as such. It arises out of events. And it did in Iraq. And this is the other war that is taking place, and that has wrecked Syria. And any idea that if Assad was removed, not that I support him, that if Assad was removed, we would have a pristine, pure democracy. I mean, we'd seen that. Look at Iraq and look at Libya. And I haven't even spoken about the Yemen, where the Saudis are completely wrecking large parts of the country and have been ignored or supported. And the Saudi was elected chairman of the United Nations Human Rights Commission last week, a new low for that organization. I mean, just think about it. It just makes a complete joke. It just sort of, what's the message to the Arab world? And you know, what it does then is, this happens on the one hand. The groups like ISIS and others, Al-Qaeda, which have arisen, Al-Qaeda was a product of the US jihad against the Russians in Afghanistan. ISIS is a product of the occupation of Iraq. The Sunni Shia divide jump up. And of course, many of these groups are now in competition with each other. So Al-Qaeda says we target Western interests and Western groups, and they accuse ISIS of targeting other Muslims, etc. But both are wrong, obviously, there's no doubt about that. But what is interesting is that ISIS claims it's more modern. If they produce brochures, they have a very strong online presence, and if you compare their brochures, seriously, I'm not joking, they are a virtual carbon copy of NATO. If you look at NATO's brochures, this is what we do, this is the planes we have, these are our drones, these are the wars we've been involved in. These guys do the same. But because they're effectively a tiny group, you know, maximum, I would say 5, 6, 7,000 people, they said, this is what we do. You use drones and this, we line up people and decapitate them with swords because we know it upsets you. And we knock down all your statues. We don't care about your culture. Crazy and psychotic, yes. But the question then has to be raised. And this is a question of, you know, morality. Is killing 15 civilians, totally innocent, with swords, worse than killing 50 people with a drone attack in Somalia, in the borders of Pakistan, Afghanistan, etc., where people die every day? Is it worse? I'm not saying is it good. We know it isn't good. But how is the other thing better? That's the point I'm making. And too often in the West now, people have become accustomed to double standards. What we do is automatically right. What they do is automatically wrong. And I think in most cases, what they do and what we do, so-called, are usually, both sides are often wrong. If not 100% of the time, certainly 99% of the time. They're wrong. And then this whole wave of wars to remodel and reshape the energy-rich world have become part and parcel of a campaign that has, in my opinion, created a wave of Islamophobia in the Western world. I mean, just even if you look, some bright young scholar will no doubt one day do this, but to compare just in terms of numbers, the books produced on Islam after 9/11, between 9/11 and say now, and that had been written on Islam prior to that. I think you'll find that more books have appeared on Islam after 9/11 than the entire period, centuries before that. Why? Most of these, I mean, there's some very good books, some strong, powerful books. Most of them are pretty awful, really. Just designed to use, it's me too. Can I write my book attacking Islam too, sir? And, you know, it's curious, this, because I've never been religious any time in my life, as anyone who reads my writings know. But it's like non-religious Jews who were forced, when they saw crimes being committed, they spoke up. This doesn't mean that we defend the absurdities and atrocities carried out, the attitude to women, to homosexuality. I mean, all religious fundamentalist groups, Muslims, Jews, Christians, are bad on all these questions. I mean, the documents they read, the Old Testament in particular, which is the mother of all documents in this regard, is filled with stuff like this: revenge, bloodshed, sodomy, this, kill, battle, war. So it's not just one fundamentalism which takes this up. It's quite common, and that should not be defended. There's absolutely no reason for anyone attacking Islamophobia to justify that. But if you read what is being written in France, sometimes in Germany, in Britain, about Islam and Muslims, and you compare it, as I have done, with what was being written about the Jews in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and sometimes even in the 50s, it's not so different. It really isn't that different. They're the other. They're not part of us. They never will be part of us. Their Sabbath day is different. They have restrictions on this. They eat halal meat, they eat kosher meat. They don't like having pigs being slaughtered. I bet not get on to that subject, sorry. No pigs today. So if you look at the words that are used, they wear funny clothes. You know, the Jews in the East End of London wore kaftans. Now you wear salwar kameez or larger robes than that. Even the language is the same. The Daily Mail, leading tabloid paper, someone recently went and picked out a headline from its rank saying, "Floods of Jewish refugees threaten Britain." It's 1932. The same paper, without any awareness of its own history, floods of Syrian refugees pouring into Europe. Even, you know, they have a strange memory. There is no shame. So in this world, where the situation is worse than I ever remember it, and not just the Arab world, by the way, many other parts of the world. What are we to do? I think the only thing we can do as citizens is to fight back, is not to take these things lying down, is to organize, is to protest, is to fight for a better world, and change will come. Because one thing history has taught us, that when you have huge mass movements, initially they can take you by surprise and win. Nobody thought that Hosni Mubarak was going to be defeated so easily. I mean, it is true that his decision to put his son in its place had antagonized the army. And in my opinion, that was one key reason why the military didn't defend him. They said, not family rule. No, military rule is one thing, family rule, we don't like it. Here the United States doesn't offer a good model either. I mean, if we have a Clinton versus Bush contest, many in the Arab world say, well, what was wrong then with Saddam Hussein's son or Hosni Mubarak's children coming to power? We do it in our way, you do it in your way. And so, though the movements have been defeated, and I think we still are living in a period of defeat, if you like, defeat, which is now beginning to change. I travel a great deal, and the generation which is now coming of political age, 17, 18, 19, is different from preceding generations. Each generation is different from previous ones. And I think many of these young people, alienated from traditional politics, alienated from what they observe, and thus treating all politics as one thing, they are now realizing that they can form and create their own politics. And they do it the best way they can. I mean, partially, I think I would like to suggest that the vote in Alberta, I mean, unheard of the NDP to win power here, unheard of. The one reason for this is not that different from young people everywhere else saying enough is enough, we've got to do something, and they choose the instrument nearest them to do it with. So in Britain, they elect a leader of the Labour Party who's the most left-wing leader in the history of that party from 1890 onwards. There's never been a leader as left-wing as him. At the same time, this poor guy is now stuck with a parliamentary party which is the most right-wing parliamentary Labour Party in Labour history as well. So you never get it all in the first round. But what we mustn't lose, though it's difficult, especially difficult in the Arab world at the present moment, is to lose hope. Because there are two responses to this. One is just total despair, which I understand too. But despair is a passive emotion. It makes you very passive. Whereas hope is an active emotion. And on that activity rests the future of our planet and, of course, the Arab world. Thank you.